Jill Biden insults John Kennedy. John's one-line comeback stuns the entire nation. The grand ballroom of the Washington, D.C. Convention Center shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, its polished marble floors reflecting the elegance of the Unity for America Women's Summit. The air buzzed with anticipation as political elites, philanthropists, and journalists mingled their conversations, a low hum beneath the clink of champagne glasses. The event, billed as a nonpartisan celebration of women's leadership, had drawn a diverse crowd from senators' wives to grassroots activists, all dressed in their finest. At the center of the room, a stage adorned with white roses and draped in navy velvet awaited the evening's keynote speakers. Among them was John Kennedy, the Louisiana senator, known for his sharp wit and folksy charm, invited to deliver a speech on bipartisan cooperation. Across the stage stood Jill Biden, former First Lady, her presence commanding yet tinged with a subtle edge. She wore a tailored emerald dress, her smile practiced but tight, her eyes occasionally darting toward John with a flicker of irritation. The tension between them was unspoken, rooted in years of political differences, but no one in the room could have predicted the spark that would ignite a national firestorm. John Kennedy stepped toward the stage, his navy suit crisp, his stride steady but unhurried. His salt and pepper hair caught the light, and his easy grin disarmed the crowd as he waved to familiar faces. He was no stranger to high-profile events, but tonight felt different. The room held a charge like the calm before a summer storm. As the moderator, a seasoned journalist with a warm but firm demeanor, introduced the evening's agenda. She called John and Jill forward for a ceremonial photo opportunity, a gesture meant to symbolize unity. The crowd applauded politely, cameras flashing as the two approached each other. John extended a hand, his expression genial, but Jill's smile faltered for a split second. As they leaned in for the photo, her lips barely moved, and she whispered sharply, just loud enough for John to hear, "Still chasing headlines, you political opportunist." The words hit like a jab, precise and cutting. John's hand froze mid-air, his eyes locking onto hers. The crowd, oblivious, continued clapping, but for John, the room seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Jill's gaze held a challenge, daring him to react. He felt the sting of her words, not just as a personal insult, but as a dismissal of his decades of public service. For a moment, John stood still, his mind racing. He could let it pass, smile for the cameras, and move on. But something in Jill's tone, the smugness of it, stirred a resolve deep within him. He straightened his jaw, tightening, and turned to face her fully, his voice low but clear, carrying a weight that silenced the air around them. "I'm no opportunist, Jill. I just fight for what's right. Something you might have forgotten how to do." The words landed like a thunderclap. The moderator's smile froze, and the photographers hesitated, their cameras still raised. A ripple of gasps spread through the front rows, those close enough to hear. Jill's face flushed, her eyes widening as she registered the sharpness of his retort. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned forward, a collective hush falling over the ballroom. John stepped back, his expression calm but unyielding, and returned to his mark on the stage. Jill, caught off guard, fumbled for composure, her hands smoothing her dress as she forced a brittle smile. The moment might have ended there, a fleeting clash forgotten by dessert. But the cameras had caught it all. Reporters in the press pool, their phones already out, began typing furiously, and within minutes, clips of the exchange were uploaded to social media. Hashtags like #KennedyStrikes back and Jill vs. John began trending the internet ablaze with reactions. Some praised John's quick wit, others decried the public spat as unbecoming, but all agreed something extraordinary had just happened. Back on stage, the moderator scrambled to regain control, ushering the speakers to their seats as the program continued. John sat his posture relaxed, but his mind alert, replaying Jill's words. He'd always known politics was a rough game, but this felt personal, a calculated jab meant to undermine him in front of the nation's elite. He glanced at Jill, now seated across the stage, her eyes fixed on the crowd, avoiding his gaze. He wondered what had prompted her attack, what resentment had simmered beneath her polished exterior. As the keynote speeches began, John's thoughts drifted to the broader implications of the moment. He'd come to the summit to talk about unity, about finding common ground in a divided nation. But Jill's words had reminded him of the undercurrents that ran beneath such events, the grudges and power plays that shaped Washington's glittering facade. He listened as the first speaker, a young activist, spoke passionately about economic equity, but his mind kept circling back to Jill's accusation. Opportunist. The word gnawed at him, not because it was true, but because it echoed the cynicism that had eroded trust in public service. He'd spent years fighting for Louisiana for tax reforms and disaster relief, often against fierce opposition. He wasn't perfect, but he'd always tried to serve with integrity. To be reduced to a caricature in a single whisper felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of the people he represented. The program paused for a brief intermission, and the room buzzed with renewed energy. Guests whispered about the confrontation, their voices a mix of shock and excitement. John stepped off the stage, greeted by a small crowd of supporters who clapped him on the shoulder, their eyes gleaming with approval. "You put her in her place," Senator, one woman said, her voice low but fervent. John nodded, offering a polite smile, but he felt no triumph. Instead, a sense of responsibility settled over him. This wasn't just about a clever comeback. It was about what came next. As he made his way to a quiet corner of the ballroom, his aide, a sharp young woman named Clara, approached her tablet glowing with notifications. "Senator, you're trending everywhere," she said, her voice a mix of awe and urgency. "People are calling it the showdown of the year. But there's something else." She hesitated, then handed him the tablet. On the screen was a grainy image of a document posted anonymously on X, claiming to be a government contract authorized without proper oversight. The signature at the bottom bore a name linked to Jill's inner circle. John's brow furrowed as he scanned the document. It detailed a $750,000 payment to a consulting firm for strategic outreach, a vague term that raised red flags. The contract was dated from a period when questions about transparency in federal spending had been rampant. He handed the tablet back to Clara, his voice steady but firm. "Find out everything you can about this, quietly." Clara nodded, already typing, her fingers a blur. John knew the risks of diving into such a controversy. Washington was a city of whispers and traps, and a single misstep could tarnish his reputation. But he also knew that ignoring the truth was worse. If the document was real, it pointed to something far bigger than a personal slight, a breach of trust that could affect countless Americans. As the summit resumed, John returned to his seat, his mind racing. The next speaker, a tech entrepreneur, droned on about innovation, but John barely heard her. He was thinking about the people back in Louisiana, the fishermen and farmers who trusted him to fight for them. He thought about the veterans who'd written him letters, their pensions delayed or denied while bureaucrats played games with public funds. The document, if verified, could be the key to exposing a pattern of misconduct. But he needed proof, and he needed allies. He glanced at the crowd, spotting a few friendly faces, senators' aides, even a reporter he trusted. He'd need their help to navigate the storm that was coming. Jill, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain her composure. She sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her smile a mask. Her aides hovered nearby, whispering urgently, their faces pale. One leaned in, showing her a phone screen with the trending hashtags. Jill's lips pressed into a thin line, and she waved the aide away. She hadn't expected John to respond so forcefully, nor had she anticipated the document leak. She'd meant her comment as a private jab, a way to vent her frustration with John's relentless criticism of policies she'd championed. But now, it had spiraled into something she couldn't control. She stole a glance at John, who was listening intently to the speaker, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she wondered if she'd underestimated him. The summit continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. Guests whispered behind their programs, their eyes darting between John and Jill. The moderators, sensing the undercurrent, hurried through the remaining speeches, eager to avoid further drama. When John's turn came to speak, the crowd leaned forward expectant. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and stepped to the podium, his movements deliberate. The room fell silent, every eye on him. He adjusted the microphone, his voice warm but resolute. "I came here tonight to talk about unity." He began his Louisiana drawl, softening the edges of his words. But unity doesn't mean ignoring what's wrong. It means facing it head-on with courage and honesty. The crowd murmured in agreement, a few clapping softly. John paused, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering briefly on Jill. "I've been called a lot of things in my time," he continued, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "But I've never been one to back down from a fight when the truth is at stake." The applause was immediate, a wave of sound that filled the ballroom. John raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "Tonight we've seen how quickly words can spark division," he said, "but they can also spark change. I don't know where this night will lead, but I promise you this. I'll keep asking the hard questions for the people who deserve answers." He stepped back, the applause swelling again, louder this time. Jill sat motionless, her face pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail, and the internet exploded anew. Clips of John's speech were shared thousands of times, his words dissected and celebrated by supporters, debated by critics. The document leak, now tied to his name, fueled speculation about what he'd do next. As the summit drew to a close, John slipped out a side door, avoiding the crush of reporters waiting at the main exit. Clara was waiting, her tablet still in hand. "We've got a lead on the document," she said, her voice low. "A whistleblower, someone who worked in procurement. They're willing to talk, but they're scared." John nodded, his expression grim. "Set it up, and get me everything we have on that consulting firm." He climbed into a waiting car, the city lights blurring past as they drove toward his office. His phone buzzed with messages, colleagues offering support, reporters requesting comments, even a text from an old friend in Louisiana. "You stirred the hornet's nest, John. Proud of you." He smiled faintly, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The document was just the beginning, a thread in a much larger tapestry. He didn't know how deep it went, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Back at the convention center, Jill lingered in a private room, her aides scrambling to draft a statement. "Say it was a misunderstanding," one suggested, but Jill shook her head, her voice weary. "It's too late for that," she said. "He's got the narrative now." She sank into a chair, staring at the wall, her mind replaying the moment she'd whispered those words. She'd wanted to rattle him, to remind him of his place. Instead, she'd handed him a platform. The document leak, whether tied to her or not, had shifted the story beyond her control. She closed her eyes, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Outside, the city hummed with the news, the hashtags and headlines spreading like wildfire. John Kennedy, the senator from Louisiana, had turned a single insult into a rallying cry, and America was listening. In the hours that followed, the story grew legs. News anchors replayed the clip of John's retort, pundits debated its implications, and ordinary Americans took to social media to share their thoughts. A teacher in Ohio posted, "I've always liked Kennedy's honesty. He said what we're all thinking." A truck driver in Texas tweeted, "About time someone called out the elite. Go get 'em, John." The document leak, though unverified, fueled speculation about corruption, with ex-users digging into the consulting firm's ties to Washington insiders. John, now back at his office, sat with Clara and a small team poring over records. The whistleblower's name, a former big-level official, was written on a notepad along with a meeting time. John leaned back. His fingers steepled his mind, already mapping the path ahead. This wasn't about Jill anymore, or even about him. It was about the truth and the people who'd been hurt by its absence. He didn't know where the trail would lead, but he was ready to follow it, no matter the cost. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled John Kennedy's Senate office, a modest space cluttered with legal pads, coffee mugs, and framed photos of Louisiana's bayous. It was well past midnight, the city outside cloaked in a restless quiet, but inside the air crackled with purpose. John sat at his desk, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, as he pored over a stack of printed emails and financial records. His aide Clara stood at a whiteboard scribbling notes about the leaked contract that had set the internet ablaze after his clash with Jill Biden at the Unity for America Women's Summit. The document, a $750,000 deal with a shadowy consulting firm, was just the tip of the iceberg. And John knew it. The summit's viral moment, his sharp retort to Jill's insult, had thrust him into the spotlight. But now the real work began. This wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about unraveling a web of deceit that had cost real people their livelihoods, their trust, and, in some cases, their lives. Clara glanced at him, her eyes tired but fierce. "The whistleblower's meeting is set for tomorrow," she said, tapping her pen against the board. "But they're nervous. We need to be careful." John nodded, his jaw set. Careful, but not silent. Let's keep digging. The next morning, Washington woke to a city buzzing with speculation. The leaked contract, now dubbed the Summit Scandal by cable news, dominated every channel. Pundits dissected John's speech, some calling him a hero, others a grandstander, but the public's attention was fixed on the document's implications. Social media platforms like X were flooded with amateur sleuths, some sharing blurry screenshots of related contracts, others posting heartfelt stories of personal loss tied to government mismanagement. A retired nurse from Baton Rouge wrote, "My husband's VA benefits were delayed for years. Now I wonder if that money went to some consultant's yacht." A factory worker in Shreveport tweeted, "Kennedy's fighting for us. About time someone asked where our tax dollars go." John, sipping black coffee in a diner near Capitol Hill, scrolled through these posts on his phone, each one a reminder of why he couldn't back down. The summit had been a spark, but the fire now burning was fueled by ordinary Americans demanding answers. The whistleblower, a wiry man in his late 40s named Paul Grayson, met John and Clara in a nondescript coffee shop in Alexandria. Paul, a former procurement officer, fidgeted with his napkin, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. "I didn't want to do this," he said, his voice low. "But after your speech, Senator, I couldn't stay quiet. People got hurt." He slid a USB drive across the table. Its contents, a digital goldmine, emails, memos, and spreadsheets, detailing a series of contracts funneled through the same consulting firm totaling over $2 million. The signatures were digital, authorized without clear oversight, and linked to a network of intermediaries with ties to Washington insiders. Paul leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping, it was deliberate. They knew the funds weren't reaching the programs they were meant for. John's fingers tightened around the drive, his mind racing. "Who's they, Paul?" he asked. Paul hesitated, then named a handful of mid-level officials, none household names, but all connected to powerful figures. "I don't know how high it goes," he admitted. "But I saw enough to know it's wrong." Back at the office, Clara and a small team of trusted staffers began cross-referencing Paul's files with public records. The consulting firm Apex Strategies was a ghost, its website, a bare-bones template, its listed address, a P.O. box in Delaware. Yet its contracts spanned multiple federal agencies from veterans services to disaster relief. One spreadsheet showed a $300,000 payment for community outreach in a Louisiana parish still recovering from a hurricane, yet locals John contacted confirmed no such outreach had occurred. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Funds earmarked for vulnerable communities were siphoned off, replaced with vague reports and inflated invoices. Clara pinned a map to the wall marking every project tied to Apex, a constellation of betrayal stretching across the country. John paced, his frustration mounting. "This isn't just about money," he said, his voice sharp. "It's about people waiting for help that never came. We need names, Clara. Real names, not just shell companies." The investigation wasn't without resistance. By midweek, John's office was inundated with calls, some supportive, others threatening. An anonymous email warned, "Drop this, Senator, or you'll regret it." A senior colleague, a senator with a reputation for playing both sides, pulled John aside in the Capitol's marble halls. "You're kicking a hornet's nest," he said, his tone paternal, but edged with warning. "This could end your career." John met his gaze unflinching. "If fighting for the truth ends my career, then it's a career not worth having." The senator walked away, shaking his head, but John felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. He wasn't naive. He knew Washington thrived on secrets and compromises. But he also knew the faces of the people he'd met back home, the widowed teacher, the veteran in a wheelchair, the single mother whose FEMA aid never arrived. Their stories weren't abstract. They were the reason he was here. Clara's research uncovered a breakthrough, an email thread between an Apex consultant and a low-level official in the Department of Health and Human Services. The official, a woman named Diane Carter, had flagged discrepancies in a $500,000 contract for medical supplies that never reached rural clinics. Her emails grew increasingly desperate, culminating in a plea to her supervisor. "We're failing these communities. Please, we need to audit this." The response was curt. "Focus on your assigned tasks." Diane, now retired, agreed to meet John in a park near the Potomac, her hands trembling as she handed him a folder. "I tried to stop it," she said, her voice cracking, "but they made it clear my job was on the line." The folder contained copies of her complaints ignored by her superiors and a single page listing 3 Apex contracts, each linked to a different agency. Diane's eyes welled up. "I'm sorry I didn't do more." John placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "You're doing it now, Diane. That's what counts." The evidence was mounting, but John knew it wasn't enough to change the system. He needed allies in Congress, and he needed the public's voice to grow louder. He reached out to a bipartisan group of senators, including a young progressive from Minnesota and a veteran conservative from Texas, both known for their integrity. Over a late-night meeting in a Senate conference room, John laid out the evidence, the USB drive glowing on the table like a beacon. The Minnesota senator, her brow furrowed, asked, How do we know this won't just get buried? John leaned forward, his voice steady. We don't, but we make it too big to ignore. We go public not with accusations, but with questions. Let the people decide what's right. The Texas senator nodded his weathered face, grim. I'm in, but we'll need more than documents. We need stories, real people, real pain. Inspired by this, John and his team began collecting testimonies. Clara set up a secure hotline, and within days, calls poured in. A firefighter from Oklahoma described how disaster relief funds promised after a tornado never materialized, leaving his town to rebuild alone. A nurse from rural Georgia spoke of patients dying while waiting for subsidized care, their applications lost in a bureaucratic void. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry, and John felt the weight of every one. He spent hours listening, his notepad filled with names and details, his resolve hardening with each call. One evening, a soft-spoken woman named Maria called from New Orleans. Her voice trembled as she described her son, a veteran who'd died waiting for mental health services. They said the funding was there, she said, choking back tears. But it wasn't. Senator, please don't let this happen to someone else. John's throat tightened and he promised her, We're fighting for you, Maria. For all of them. The public's response was electric. Grassroots groups organized rallies, small but passionate outside federal buildings. A viral video showed a group of veterans in Missouri holding signs reading, Where's our money? A college student in California launched a petition for a congressional audit gathering 50,000 signatures in 48 hours. John, though cautious about fueling division, saw an opportunity to channel this energy. He agreed to a prime-time interview with a respected journalist, Maria Vasquez, whose no-nonsense style had earned her a loyal following. The interview, broadcast live from a studio overlooking the Capitol, was a turning point. Maria didn't mince words. Senator, you've stirred up a storm, she said, her eyes piercing. But some say you're chasing fame, not truth. What's your end game? John leaned forward, his voice steady but earnest. My end game is simple answers. People trusted their government, and that trust was broken. I'm not here to point fingers. I'm here to find out why, and make sure it stops. He shared Maria's story, careful to protect her identity, and described the firefighter, the nurse, and others, their voices woven into his own. He held up a redacted version of the Apex contract, its details blurred, but its existence undeniable. This isn't about one firm or one official, he said. It's about a system that let these contracts slip through while people suffered. The interview struck a chord. Viewers flooded X with support, the hashtag #TruthWithKennedy, trending alongside clips of his words. A retired teacher posted, I've never seen a politician talk like that, so real, so human. Even skeptics began to listen, drawn by John's refusal to sensationalize. He wasn't naming villains or claiming victory. He was asking questions, and America was ready to ask them too. Behind the scenes, the pressure was intensifying. Clara received a tip about a second whistleblower, a former Apex employee, willing to testify anonymously. The employee's information pointed to a meeting where officials had discussed streamlining contract approvals, bypassing standard checks. John, sensing the stakes rising, met with his Senate allies to plan their next move. They agreed to draft a resolution calling for an independent audit of federal contracts, a move that would force the issue into the open. But John knew the resolution alone wouldn't heal the wounds. He needed to connect with the people directly. Against Clara's advice, he announced a town hall in Louisiana open to anyone affected by government mismanagement. It's risky, Clara warned. The media will swarm, and so will your critics. John smiled, his eyes resolute. Good. Let them come. The truth doesn't hide from a crowd. As the town hall approached, John's office became a war room. Staffers sorted through hundreds of RSVPs, each accompanied by a story of loss or betrayal. A volunteer, a young law student named Ethan, read one aloud, his voice breaking. It was from a widower whose wife had died after a delayed surgery, the hospital citing funding issues. Ethan looked at John, his eyes wide. How do you keep going, Senator, knowing how many people are hurting? John paused, then answered quietly, because if I stop, their stories stop too. And I won't let that happen. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. They were no longer just a team. They were a movement bound by a shared mission to shine a light where shadows had grown too long. The chapter closed with John standing at his office window, the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. His phone buzzed with a text from Paul the whistleblower. More documents coming. Stay safe. John's heart raced, not with fear but with clarity. The summit had been a moment, a flash of defiance. But this was the fight. The truth was out there, buried in files, whispered in quiet corners, carried in the voices of the forgotten. He didn't know how far it would take him or what it would cost, but he knew one thing: he was all in. The people deserved answers, and he was determined to find them, one document, one story, one step at a time. The Louisiana sun hung low over the community center in Baton Rouge, casting long shadows across the parking lot where a modest crowd gathered. It was a far cry from the glittering chandeliers of the Unity for America Women's Summit. But for John Kennedy, this was where the real work happened. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle filled with a cross-section of America veterans in faded caps, single mothers clutching worn purses, retirees with trembling hands, and young activists with hopeful eyes. They had come for the town hall John had promised, drawn by his call for truth, after his viral clash with Jill Biden and the mounting evidence of misused government funds. The air was thick with anticipation, not for a spectacle, but for something rarer, a chance to be heard. John stood at the front, no podium, no suit jacket, just a rolled-up shirt and a microphone. His voice warm with that familiar Louisiana drawl cut through the hum of the room. "Tonight isn't about me," he began, his eyes meeting those of a gray-haired woman in the front row. "It's about you, your stories, your losses, your fight. Let's talk." The room leaned in, and with that, the final chapter of this saga began not with confrontation or investigation, but with connection, accountability, and a quiet promise of healing. John had spent the weeks since the summit building a case, collecting whistleblower testimonies and contract records that pointed to a systemic failure. The leaked Apex Strategies documents, now verified by independent auditors, had sparked a national conversation with rallies and petitions demanding reform. But John knew documents alone couldn't mend the damage. The people in this room, and millions like them, needed more than proof of wrongdoing. They needed to know their pain mattered. He invited the first speaker, a retired firefighter named Carl, to share his story. Carl's voice shook as he described his town's struggle to rebuild after a flood promised FEMA funds that never arrived, while Apex pocketed hundreds of thousands for consulting. "We lost homes, businesses," Hope Carl said, his eyes glistening. "I'm here because you, Senator, asked the question we couldn't. Where'd the money go?" The room erupted in applause, not loud but heartfelt, a release of years of frustration. John nodded his hand on Carl's shoulder and passed the microphone to a nurse named Lena, who spoke of patients turned away from underfunded clinics. One by one, they stood, teachers, veterans, parents, each story, a wound, each voice, a step toward reclaiming dignity. Outside, a small group of reporters live-streamed the event, their cameras capturing something raw and unpolished. Social media, still buzzing from the #TruthWithKennedy movement, amplified the testimonies. A college student in Ohio tweeted, "This isn't politics. This is people finally being seen." A grandmother in Nevada posted, "I cried watching that nurse. Kennedy's giving us a voice." The town hall wasn't just a local event. It was a mirror held up to a nation grappling with betrayal. John listened to every speaker, his notepad forgotten, his focus absolute. When a young man named Jamal, whose brother had died waiting for VA mental health care, broke down mid-sentence, John stepped forward, offering a steady hand. "Take your time, son," he said softly. "We're all here." Jamal finished his story, and the room rose in a standing ovation, not for John, but for the courage it took to speak. In that moment, John realized this was bigger than any contract or scandal. It was about restoring trust, not just in government, but in each other. The town hall stretched past 2 hours, but no one left. When the last speaker, an elderly widow named Rose, finished describing her husband's denied pension, John took the microphone. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. "I've heard you tonight," he said, "and I promise you, we're not done. But this isn't about pointing fingers or settling scores. It's about making sure no one else sits in a room like this feeling forgotten." He announced plans for a bipartisan Senate task force to audit federal contracts, a proposal already gaining traction in Congress. But more than that, he pledged to keep holding town halls, to keep listening. "Truth isn't a one-time fix," he said. "It's a commitment." The crowd applauded, but their eyes told the real story: gratitude, resolve, and a flicker of hope. As the event ended, people lingered, shaking John's hand, sharing photos of loved ones lost to systemic failures. Rose pressed a faded military medal into his palm, whispering, "For my husband. Keep fighting." John nodded, his throat tight, and slipped the medal into his pocket, a reminder of the stakes. The next morning, Washington felt different. The town hall had aired on local stations and spread online, its authenticity cutting through the noise of partisan bickering. John's office was flooded with emails, not just from Louisiana, but from every state, each one a plea, a thank you, or a story. Clara, sorting through the messages, looked up at John, her eyes wide. "Senator, this is changing things. People aren't just angry, they're inspired." John smiled faintly, but his focus was on the next step. He met with his Senate allies, the Minnesota Progressive and Texas Conservative, to finalize the audit resolution. The meeting was tense, some senators worried about political fallout, but John's resolve was unshakable. "This isn't about left or right," he said, his voice firm. "It's about right and wrong. We owe these people action." The resolution passed committee that afternoon, a rare bipartisan victory, and news outlets hailed it as a turning point. But John knew the real test was still ahead, ensuring the audit led to accountability, not just reports gathering dust. Meanwhile, Jill Biden, who had remained silent since the summit, faced mounting pressure. The Apex contracts, though not directly tied to her, had implicated aides from her husband's administration. Her team had tried to spin the summit incident as a misunderstanding, but the public wasn't buying it. Posts on X called for her to address the scandal with hashtags like #JillSpeakUp, trending alongside #TruthWithKennedy. Finally, she agreed to a televised statement, standing alone at a podium in a Delaware community center. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, her voice measured but heavy. "I said something at the summit. I regret," she began. "I called Senator Kennedy an opportunist, and that was wrong. But more than that, I stood by while systems failed the people I swore to serve." She paused, her eyes glistening. I didn't sign those contracts, but I didn't ask enough questions. For that, I'm sorry." She looked directly into the camera, her voice breaking. "Senator Kennedy, you've shown what courage looks like. I hope we can all learn from it." The statement was a bombshell. Pundits debated whether it was genuine or damage control, but for John, it was a step toward accountability. He watched the broadcast in his office, Clara and Ethan at his side. "She didn't have to do that," Clara said, her voice soft. John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "No, she didn't. But it's a start." He didn't gloat or issue a statement. Instead, he wrote Jill a private note thanking her for her words and urging her to support the audit. The gesture, small but sincere, signaled his intent. This wasn't about personal vendettas, but about fixing what was broken. The public noticed. A viral post on X read, "Kennedy could have slammed her, but he didn't." That's leadership. The narrative was shifting not toward division, but toward a shared goal of reform. The audit task force began its work, but John's focus remained on the people. He traveled to small towns across the South, hosting more town halls, each one a tapestry of stories. In Alabama, a mechanic shared how his community center lost funding to a consulting deal, forcing kids into the streets. In Mississippi, a teacher described classrooms without books, while Apex billed for educational services. John listened, asked questions, and promised action, but he also did something unexpected. He shared his own doubts. At a Georgia event, he admitted, "There are days I wonder if we're moving fast enough, if I'm doing enough. But your voices keep me going." The admission, raw and unguarded, resonated. A young mother posted online, "He's not just a senator, he's human. That's why I trust him." The town halls became a movement, not for John, but for the idea that truth could rebuild what corruption had torn apart. As the audit uncovered more irregularities, $4 million in misallocated funds across a dozen agencies, Congress faced pressure to act. A new bill, the Transparency in Contracting Act, was introduced, mandating public disclosure of federal contracts and stricter oversight. John co-sponsored it, working late nights to refine its language. At a Capitol Hill press conference, he stood beside colleagues from both parties, his voice steady. "This bill isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning. We're telling every American, your tax dollars matter, and so do you." The crowd of reporters and onlookers applauded, but John's eyes were on a small group of town hall attendees he'd invited, including Carl and Rose, their faces beaming with quiet pride. The bill passed the Senate weeks later, a testament to the power of their stories. The chapter's climax came at a candlelight vigil on the National Mall, organized by grassroots groups inspired by the town halls. Thousands gathered holding candles and photos of loved ones lost to systemic failures. Veterans, patients, families. John was invited to speak, but he insisted on reading names first, a roll call of the forgotten. Carl Thompson, he began firefighter, lost his home to a flood. Lena Harris, nurse, fought for her patients. Jamal's brother, veteran, deserved better. Each name was met with a wave of candlelight, a silent promise to remember. When John finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "Truth hurts, but it also heals," he said. "We've uncovered pain these past months, but we've also found strength in you, in each other. This vigil isn't the end of our work. It's a pledge to keep going, to build a system that serves, not steals." He raised his candle, and thousands followed the mall, glowing like a sea of stars. A young girl in the crowd, clutching her mother's hand, whispered, "He's talking about us." Her mother nodded, tears streaming, and posted a photo online with the caption, "Tonight we were heard." The vigil marked a turning point, not just for John, but for a nation. The Transparency Act, though imperfect, was a concrete step, and the audit continued exposing more firms like Apex. Jill Biden, true to her word, testified before the task force her candor, earning reluctant respect. But the real legacy was in the people. Community groups formed to monitor local budgets, students launched apps to track federal spending, and families shared their stories, no longer silenced. John, back in Louisiana, sat in his office, Rose's medal on his desk. A letter from Jamal arrived thanking him for giving his brother's death meaning. John read it twice, his eyes misting, then tucked it away. He wasn't done. More town halls, more reforms awaited, but for now he felt a quiet peace. The lesson was clear truth, though costly was the foundation of justice. Every voice, no matter how small, could spark change. And in a world of noise, listening was the greatest act of leadership. The story closed with a call to action, not for applause, but for engagement. "This isn't just my fight," John had said at the vigil. "It's ours." He urged the crowd to vote, to question, to speak, reminding them that democracy thrived on accountability. For the listeners, the message was educational, a reminder that integrity in leadership wasn't about perfection, but about persistence. It was about choosing every day to do what was right, even when it was hard. As the candles flickered out, America felt a shift, not toward division, but toward a shared resolve to heal, to rebuild, and to never let the truth be silenced again.